that has or houses the descendants of a very, very advanced civilization. Now, today anthropologists are saying that of the three major civilizations of the Americas, the Mayans were the most developed. And we have the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas.
People might want to have their notebooks out, not to copy slavishly, but just to put down some key concepts, because you're going to have written homework every week.
Raquel, can you repeat? I'm sorry, I was trying to listen to them.
Of the three.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just heard Mayans, Aztecs,
and Incas. And those are the Andean civilization. That one's primarily in Peru, but extended through Bolivia, northern part of Chile, and northern part of Argentina and Ecuador. Okay? So when you think about where the Mayans are located, they're pretty much in Guatemala, part of Honduras, parts of El Salvador, and Belize. And I don't put Belize there, but it's, if you go in the map, that's where they are. So what makes them different from the other groups, I may just mention a few things, just so that you just separate them from other Mesoamerican civilizations. They come from the Olmecs, right? The Olmecs were an earlier Mayan group, right? And the Mayans took most of their culture and then developed it. What we still see today about the Mayans is the different linguistic groups. And you will see that even in Guatemala. In the region that we're going to visit are the Cachiquels. That's their language. But we go across the Lake Atitlan into Santiago, and that's a Tichtuil. I have a real hard time pronouncing some of those. So there are different dialects. They communicate very easily with each other. Now, when we go to church, I was mentioning that in class today, so Carolina heard this already. If you listen in church, you're going to see a perfect blending of two languages. The Cachiquel, which is in San Lucas, what they speak, and the Spanish. So you're sitting in church and you're listening to the sermon, and you can pick out some of the Spanish words, but then the rest sounds like gibberish to you, to your ear, because that's their Cachiquel. So perfect blending of the languages, and they communicate perfectly, okay, with each other. So the Mayans were a fairly homogeneous group as a culture. So what happened was, as they developed from more or less 250 AD to 900, they went through that period of explosion and development. And the way we see it in these dynastically huge cities that they built. The ceremonial temples, we're going to talk a little bit about the religion. The temples were for the worship of ancestors. The ceremonial temples were used for that purpose. And how did they achieve it? Primarily with the help of the slaves. Now you think, okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that the Mayans, in comparison to the Aztecs, were a lot more calm. They weren't big warriors, right? But they did get the slaves because they had a very hierarchical society where they had the higher ups, the nobles and the priests, and then a sort of a middle class and the slaves, or the low class, that were doing the heavy duty kind of work. So all these Mesoamerican civilizations and the Incas had a very stratified kind of society to get the work done, right? They did not have the wheel. And it's amazing what they were able to achieve and build without any metal tools or the wheel. This just kind of gives you a little sketch, picture of Tikal. This is in northern Guatemala. This region is today a big tourist attraction, you know. We are far from here, but an awful lot of tourists will go visit this region. This is Chichen Itza, and I just kind of have the Spanish way of writing it, right? And you see this as this temple everywhere as a good example of their ceremonial temples. Now, the Mayans were incredible astronomers and mathematicians. The Aztecs were fairly good with the calendar, but the Mayans were a lot more evolved in astronomy and mathematics. They had the concept of the zero that was incredible, and they established this numerical system which they applied to their buildings, okay, as when they were doing their big projects, and also as a way to organize their agricultural projects. They had a calendar about 1,300 years before we did, and that gives you a sense of how evolved they were. Another thing that is very, very important of the Mayans is the writing system. And I will show you a slide pretty soon, and it's very stylized symbols of the snake and pretty much many of them from their animals or the stars, the moon. The system evolved. So by the time the Spaniards arrived to the New World, the symbols also had an oral sound to them. So it was an evolution from writing to also oral, which that gives you a sense of how they had incorporated the writing to then an oral tradition. So they could write something and someone could read it by also making the sounds. So we begin to have an oral tradition with the Mayans, which we did not have with the Aztecs, in other words. So you have these stories that are carved in stones, but someone could read them and someone could listen to it and get the story. This is some samples of their symbols. Now, with religion, and you're going to really get a sense of how much religion is part of the Mayan culture. And I'm going to leave for the visit of Donna, Sister Donna, to really explain to us how that system of belief is sort of lived today. Because she has lived with Mayan people and is able to also see that those parallels between their system of beliefs and the Christian beliefs. They basically, as an agricultural society, had their cosmovision very tied to nature and also to their domestic life and work. They were definitely into ancestor worship. And I mentioned that before about the ceremonial temples, and that is very unique of them. So, above all, everything is sacred. Everything that surrounds you is sacred, including you, right? So this notion of a sacralized universe, everything is tied. And if you defile something around you, it will affect you too. They use the calendar and their astronomy to help, and they have a very, very elaborate model of the cosmos. Very, very sophisticated. Okay? So since the gods were kind of part of this vision, what they would do is they would get to the shamans or the priests when things were not going so good for them. They would seek out the help of the priests or the shamans to tell them, yeah, what's happening is the alignment of the stars and are the alignments not right for me right now? And what should I do kind of to protect myself through this bumpy time, right? So I think Sister Donna is going to address this whole notion of the number 4. That it's a way for them to organize the cosmos. Okay, and they also use the cardinal points as a way to refer to the boundaries of the cosmos. All right, but it's very, very elaborate, and I don't think that it, I'm just going to let it go. Now, these gods of the forest, were the ones that helped them evolve, okay, and develop. So for them, to be able to have harmony with the gods of the forest was crucial for their survival. There was only one god, the Chacmol, and if there is no one here, in one of my classes we read a story from Carlos Fuentes that deals with the Chacmol, and it's the only deity that they had, they would offer a human sacrifice to. They killed animals, but they were really not as bloody as the Aztecs. The Aztecs loved to sacrifice humans, yes.
So they thought by sacrificing a human being, that would bring rain or sustenance to the earth, right? Okay.
So to the Chacmol, which is the god of the rain, is the only one they gave.
I might be confusing this with the Aztecs, but is it this god that they would have to have their human sacrifice crying while they were killed?
Crying?
Yeah, like crying, like the tears, like became like the rain. Might be the Aztecs then.
The Aztecs, pretty much, the sacrifice was very, just pulling out the heart of the. Now, for the Chacmol, they were primarily young women, virgins, very, very young. And
We'll make sure that none of you get sacrificed, by the way.
That's great. Do they still practice this?
Yeah. So, and this is interesting. When you think about, this is one of their gods, the god of sky and thunder. They thought that he had actually been to earth and lived among them to teach them the arts of civilization. What other god came down from heaven and lived among us? So when they transitioned from their beliefs to the Christian beliefs, there's many points of, they could understand the concept of Jesus as a God coming to earth because they had that in their own system of beliefs. And so what happened around 900, to the conquest is that they began to kind of go bankrupt, and they had bad periods of drought. So they had these really, really huge cities that they had to sustain. Food crisis because of droughts. And the rulers kept spending and spending money to build more temples, to appease the gods, to make sure that things continue to go. So cities began to crumble. And as a result of that, then there were uprisings. People were going hungry, so they would attack other cities. And that's how, by the time, when the Spaniards arrived, the whole empire had begun to weaken. And of course, the Spaniards took advantage of that. These were when you think the Titsugil, okay, this is a city that we don't know whether we're going to visit, but it's on the other side of the lake where we're going to stay. This is basically the language group of that community. This is the community of San Lucas, and some of that we have those two groups, Quiche and Quiche. Now, so the arrival of the Spaniards, they come in and they immediately sense the divisions, right? So they tried initially to kind of band with each other, but they looked at the Spaniards and they said, well, we got to kind of change camps because we don't have that much. So initially the Quiches and the Caciquels, they were talking about getting together. And then at the very last minute, the Caciquels said, no, we're signing with the Spaniards. And that was that. That was the end. So the Spaniards, in order to consolidate their power, they pretty much did it by brute force. They killed the ruling class, and the rest was done with epidemics. Do we know what illnesses the Spaniards brought?
Smallpox.
Smallpox. What else?
Syphilis.
Syphilis. So between hunger, epidemics, and the killing of the Spaniards, they decimated the population. Now, went from, these figures are just staggering when you think about how many of them they just wiped out. Yeah.
Despite the fact where were there interracial relationships taking place and marriages? Not marriages, but I mean maybe rapes perhaps.
That
was
certainly
there?
happened. It happened with the Aztecs. As a matter of fact, Cortez had the Malinche, who was a woman, his translator, and that's how he managed to penetrate the nobility because they had this cross-cultural relationship there, and that's how they pretty much took over that empire.
So the people that we'll be meeting in that area, ethnically, do they identify? Are they multi-ethnic, the culture, or is it predominantly they all derive from the same ancestry? They all come from the Mayans.
They're all descendant Mayans.
So there's little to none.
They have different linguistics groups, okay? But that's always been the case in the evolution of the empire.
But no, there's no Spanish ethnicity within
Oh,
there?
no.
Okay.
Yes. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute. As a matter of fact,
The answer is yes.
Yes, the answer is yes, and I will have it in a minute. The Ladinos, the Ladinos are mixed Mayan and Spanish.
Okay.
They're called Ladinos. See?
It's like can you go back just real quick? Yeah. Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
And we're going to talk about
Okay.
that the Ladinos, and then you have the Creoles. The Creoles are the Spanish that come in, and they pretty much, Spanish parents, and they're the kids of the Spanish parents that are born in Guatemala. They're going to be the Creoles, right? The Ladinos are the mixture, and then you have the pure Mayan. If you can talk about, you have Mayans of different groups, but they're descendants Mayan. So you have Ladinos, Mayans, pure Mayans, and then the Creoles. Okay? And how did this Spaniards manage to take over, right? And this begins to set us in time for colonial transition. So what they did is they took over their land, right? They took over their land, and then they had land that they confiscated, and the people that lived in that land. The people that lived in that land then became the forced labor. Perfect, right? So they had, they took hold of these huge extensions of land, and then they had slaves. And during colonial time, there were a number of priests, that Bartolomé de las Casas being one that we always remember, that kept saying to the crown, "You can't do this. How do you justify the colonization of the Americas, and you're doing this to the native people?" But it was a way to advance their power and advance the settlement of themselves. So what we have after the Spaniards come in and take over, we have the establishment of a very sectarian and race-based system, which you have still today. That this system still is present today, and you will see it.
What do you mean by race-based?
Race-based meaning us, Spaniards, descendant Europeans, or Europeans that have come into the New World and have children in here, and the rest.
So it's no.
So you talk about the Latinos. The Latinos are a mix, right? Spaniard, Maya, but it's a group that is moved up in society. So what the Latinos do, they separate themselves the Mayan that are on the Mayan.
So the Ladinos would have been the ones that were recruited into the military and brought to the School of the Americas.
Yeah, I'm trying to get really back to
Right.
So where, so the Latinos, where
Ladinos.
Latinos, where are they located in South America?
Let me just see whether Ladinos like that, right?
Yeah.
So this is
Are they like in one area?
categorization that is unique of Guatemala.
Oh, okay.
Yes. There are
So
no
it's not-
Latinos in Peru or in Argentina.
They would be called something else, though.
Yes.
Yeah, like for example, like in the Dominican Republic, they're called taínos.
Yes, ma'am.
We're called taínos because we have the accent or how do you pronounce it in the Dominican Republic? I don't remember. But it was like a mixture of the Spanish. So Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, we're considered taínos.
And the Taínos were a lesser developed group also in
Yeah.
Mesoamerica.
And you'll, Ladinos are, there's not geographically, there's Ladinos who live in San Lucas, and they do or don't talk about it too much, would you say?
Well, because talking about it is recognizing or admitting to the fact that you have a race-based society. No one wants to own up to that, but it is a reality. It's because what has happened is the descendants of the Mayans, the poor Mayans, or the majority in Guatemala, that have been displaced and don't have access to education, they're now so far separated from the other world that has had the access to education and a better standard of living. That they don't want to be associated with them.
So it's not necessarily blatant segregation, but it's like an unspoken understanding, or is it like, is it imposed? You
Well,
know?
we will see.
Mhm.
We will see when we talk about the Civil War, and now we're gonna move into the present. The 36-year Civil War was definitely a racial. It was genocide going after certain segments of society that had been mobilized to protest against an oppressive ruling class. A handful of families that hold all the wealth of the country.
It's all about the ownership of the land. So the ownership of the land was taken away from them 500 years ago, and that is part of what we will be seeing, how the mission buys land and gives it to the Mayan people to restore the land. And you have to realize that the land is not just like us, it's Mother Earth. So it's really restoring everything to them, including their religion.
Because for them, they were so interconnected to their land. I mean, it was because the way of comprehending the cosmos and the universe and their place in it, it was tied to the land. You take that from them, and they're nothing.
Just to bring the point home, so the lady who cooks for us, her name is Chona, so she's in charge of the kitchen. Her husband was the head of he was like the lay person in charge of the parish. So he was the one in charge of getting the land bought and then distributing it to the people. He was killed. So that's how serious this is. Any restoration of the land to the Mayans during the Civil War was cause for death. Right.
So the idea is for you to see that this encomienda system, which started up in colonial times and has evolved somewhat, is still in place. And then you still have the tensions in a society that is so unfair and unjust to the majority of Guatemalans, because there's only 19 families that hold most of the wealth. So that is, and you will see that. Now the Latinos, when doing, and we're going to talk a little bit about this when we talk about the Civil War. The Latinos, because they were more educated, urban, were during the uprisings of the Civil War the ones that organized the peasants. So you have some Latinos that have come to through a conflict of conscience and wanted change in Guatemala. So not all the Latinos are against the Mayans. During the Civil War, there were urban Latinos that were organizing the Mayans in the highlands where we're going to visit. All right.
And so Latinos, we can't give the impression that Latinos are like bad people.
No.
They were poor, you know, and so, you know, they get employed to do a job. And all through many countries, you'll see people like Latinos, that lower middle class, who are the police force, you know, and the military, because that's a source of income.
Right.
So they're just taking care of their families.
And if you go, I remember when I visited Peru, we'd go into a store and there were a group, middle class. They would talk about the Incas that come into town, and we were talking about where these people come. Oh, they come from the mountains, you know, with all their goods, and they just congregate in the plaza, and they just bring all these things. The way they were talking about them, these native peoples, they need to make to have some way to make a living. So they would bring their goods to the market, and these businesses, you know, they were talking about them, they'll go buy from them to our stores. So essentially, they were grudging the native peoples from coming into town, and just, you know, they're uneducated, so they themselves support a system that marginalizes certain groups so that they get the bigger share of whatever, of the wealth and the business activity. So this kind of ends Guatemala at times does go through its own wars of independence like the rest of Latin America, and there are about 10 years, 15 years difference between one country or the other, but in the early 19th century they all gained independence from
Were there any outside countries that didn't like the idea of the United States of Latin America? So what do you think the country was that didn't like having a powerful united country south of the border? The United States didn't like it. Divide and conquer. Keep them separate. Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, I remember when my mom was at Boston, she was at 3, not at least that.
So
we start with the present time. You're trying to remember the one word question?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, so I asked her if she could explain it to me, and she struggled.
Well, the United States just said that nobody should meddle. That basically, we're in charge of anything that goes on south of our border. And anybody who messes with that has to deal with the United States Army.
Yeah, but why is that?
That you're asking, like, the key question of the...
Like, why did that ever make, like, where did it completely think about it?
Power.
I know, well, I know, but I mean, I'm sure it was different times and it was different circumstances as well, so that's where everyone had power by land, so I'm sure that was kind of their, but, I don't know.
Marina, would you open the other cookies there? I kind of have a taste for that kind of cookie.
And the other one over there.
Oh, okay.